Meet Miguel Alvarez, a 48-year-old janitor at Kingston Industries. By day, he mops floors and empties trash cans, just another invisible worker in a towering corporate empire. But Miguel holds a secret: he knows more about the company's failing production lines than the executives running it. Then, one day, the rich widow who owns it all invites him to a high-stakes boardroom meeting. The powerful men at the table expect a joke. What happens next? Nobody, not even Miguel, is ready for it. If you love jaw-dropping stories of hidden talent and shocking twists, hit subscribe. We've got more coming soon. The Kingston Industries boardroom was unusually tense, thick with the kind of anticipation that made even the most confident executives straighten their ties and exchange wary glances. At the head of the long, polished mahogany table sat Stephen Caldwell, the company's sharp-witted CFO, his fingers drumming impatiently against the surface. To his left, Richard Bennett, the COO, leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Today's meeting was supposed to be straightforward, a discussion on the company's failing manufacturing efficiency and a vote on hiring yet another overpriced consulting firm. Then, the doors swung open. And every single person in the room fell silent. Victoria Kingston, the formidable 62-year-old widow of the company's late founder, strode in with effortless authority. Her tailored navy blazer and signature pearl earrings reflected her status, a woman who didn't just sit at the table, she owned the table. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man who didn't belong in this room. Miguel Alvarez, 48, in his dark blue janitor's uniform, gripped a mop handle like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His work boots scuffed the pristine marble floor, leaving behind faint streaks of cleaning solution. The air grew heavier. The executives exchanged bewildered glances. Why was a janitor here? No one knew it yet, but this moment, the moment Miguel Alvarez stepped into that boardroom, was about to change everything. Miguel Alvarez had spent nearly a decade walking these halls, yet no one in this room had ever really seen him before. To them, he was just another worker in the background, a man whose presence blended into the polished floors he cleaned. But today was different. Today, every single pair of eyes in the boardroom was locked onto him, and the weight of their judgment pressed down like a heavy stone on his chest. The contrast was stark. The executives in tailored suits, checking their Rolex watches, adjusting silk ties, sat rigid in their seats. Miguel, in his faded janitor's uniform, felt painfully out of place. He wasn't holding a briefcase full of reports, his fingers gripped a damp cleaning rag he had forgotten to put down. His boots were worn, his knuckles calloused from years of labor, but he stood upright, silent and waiting. The disbelief in the room was almost tangible. Richard Bennett let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head as if this were some kind of elaborate joke. Next to him, Stephen Caldwell leaned forward, his fingers steepled together, carefully masking his irritation. Finally, he cleared his throat and forced a polite smile. "Mrs. Kingston," he began, his voice measured, "I assume there's a reason for this unexpected guest." Victoria, standing at the head of the table, didn't even blink. Instead, she offered a slow, knowing smile, the kind that made men like Caldwell nervous. "Yes," she said simply, "and I think you'll want to listen." Miguel swallowed hard. This was it. The moment he could either disappear, or prove them all wrong. Silence thickened in the boardroom, stretching longer than it should have. Miguel could feel it, the unspoken doubt, the quiet skepticism radiating from the men and women at the table. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this room. Not in their world. His fingers tightened around the rag still clutched in his hand, damp with cleaning solution. He forced himself not to wipe his palms on his uniform, though every instinct screamed at him to move, to shrink, to vanish into the background like he always had. But Victoria Kingston wasn't going to let that happen. She strode forward, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, and took her seat at the head of the table. Every executive watched her, waiting for an explanation, waiting for her to say this was some kind of experiment, a publicity stunt, a mistake. She didn't. Instead, she laced her fingers together, rested them on the polished table, and let the silence stretch just a little longer. "I know what you're all thinking," she said at last, her voice calm but edged with something that made even the most seasoned executives sit up straighter. "And I don't care." A few exchanged uneasy glances. Miguel exhaled slowly. He was used to being ignored, but today was different. Today, he wasn't invisible, he was the center of attention, and the weight of it was suffocating. His gut told him to run. But then Victoria turned, eyes locking onto him. "I asked Miguel to be here," she continued, voice unwavering. "And by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why." Miguel had never felt more unsure. Or more terrified. Miguel's throat was dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. The weight of a dozen powerful stares pressed down on him, heavy with skepticism, curiosity, and thinly veiled dismissal. He wasn't a man accustomed to being watched, his job was to move unseen, to clean up messes without a trace. But today, there was nowhere to hide. He shifted slightly, his boots scuffing the marble floor. The sound felt deafening in the suffocating silence. His worn uniform, the same one he had worn for years without a second thought, now felt like a mark of separation, a reminder that he did not belong in this world of power suits and multimillion-dollar deals. Across the table, Stephen Caldwell tapped a pen against his notepad, barely masking his impatience. Richard Bennett, always one to enjoy a spectacle, leaned back in his chair, watching Miguel the way one might watch a street performer attempting an impossible trick. Victoria, however, remained unfazed. She tilted her head slightly, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Miguel. "Tell me, Miguel," she said, her voice smooth yet commanding, "how long have you worked at Kingston Industries?" Miguel hesitated. His voice felt like sandpaper against his throat, but he forced himself to answer. 9 years, he said, barely louder than a whisper. "And in those 9 years," Victoria continued, "how many times have you stepped foot into this room?" He swallowed. "Never." A few executives smirked. "Exactly." Victoria's lips curved into something between a smirk and a challenge. "Well," she said, leaning forward just slightly, "then I suppose today is long overdue." Miguel's fingers curled into a fist. He had a feeling she was about to change his life forever. A week earlier, Victoria Kingston had been on her way to a high-level budget meeting when something unusual stopped her in her tracks. The hallway on the 5th floor, the maintenance level, was one she rarely had reason to visit. It was where the unseen workers, the janitors, the maintenance crews, the night shift staff, kept the company running without anyone ever acknowledging them. But as she passed the supply closet, she heard voices. Not the usual break-room chatter or complaints about overtime, but something that made her pause. "You're looking at short-term gains, not the long-term impact." Her brow furrowed. That wasn't the voice of an investment strategist, but it might as well have been. She took a step closer. "If you cut the machine's cooling cycles too aggressively, you'll reduce energy costs now, sure, but in 3 months. You'll burn out the entire system. That's a $2 million failure waiting to happen." Victoria's interest sharpened. She peered into the break room and saw Miguel Alvarez, sitting at the metal lunch table across from another janitor, speaking with the authority of a seasoned engineer. His tone wasn't speculative, it was certain. For the next 15 minutes, Victoria did something she rarely did in a company she had inherited, she listened. Miguel broke down the inefficiencies in Kingston Industries' manufacturing process with stunning precision, explaining how outdated factory automation, cooling failures, and improper maintenance schedules were bleeding millions from the company. By the time he finished, Victoria wasn't just impressed, she had made a decision. Stepping into the break room, she folded her arms. "Where did you learn all that?" she asked. Miguel froze. His entire life was about to change, and he didn't even know it yet. Miguel had spent years keeping his head down, blending into the background, but in that moment, with Victoria Kingston's sharp gaze locked onto him, there was no escaping. His fingers tapped against the table, a nervous habit he hadn't shaken since childhood. He could feel his coworker tense beside him, sensing the weight of the moment. A CEO didn't just wander into the janitor's break room. And she certainly didn't stop to ask questions. He swallowed hard. His voice faltered, but he forced himself to meet her eyes. My dad owned a small machine repair shop when I was growing up. I worked with him every summer since I was 11. Learned everything I could. Victoria's expression didn't change. And your education? Miguel hesitated. He hated this part. I got into Cal State Long Beach for mechanical engineering, but, his throat tightened. I had to drop out after my dad passed. There were bills. No way to keep up with tuition. Victoria nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. I kept studying, Miguel added quickly, a quiet defiance creeping into his voice. I read manuals, kept up with new automation models, analyzed factory reports when no one was looking. He let out a dry chuckle, glancing at his worn uniform. Didn't exactly get me far, though. Victoria tilted her head, her gaze unreadable. That depends on how you define far, she said. Miguel frowned, unsure what she meant. But then Victoria did something no one in his life had ever done before. She extended a hand. Come to the next executive meeting, she said. Listen. And when I ask you something, answer honestly. Miguel stared at her, stunned. What choice did he have but to say yes? Miguel had never been more tempted to say no in his life. An executive meeting? With her? With them? Everything in him screamed that it was a bad idea, that he would step into that boardroom and be laughed out of the building before he even opened his mouth. But the way Victoria Kingston was looking at him, calm and unwavering, told him that this wasn't just a request. It was an opportunity. And opportunities like this didn't come twice. So, despite the doubt gnawing at him, he nodded. Okay. That was how, 7 days later, Miguel found himself standing in front of a glossy mahogany conference table, under the harsh glow of recessed lighting, with a dozen of the most powerful executives in the company staring him down like he had just wandered into restricted airspace. The skepticism was thick in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Stephen Caldwell, the CFO, checked his watch. Richard Bennett, the COO, exhaled sharply, his expression caught between boredom and mild irritation. Others simply stared, waiting for someone to explain why a janitor was in their boardroom. Victoria's voice cut through the tension. Miguel is here because I invited him. Richard smirked. And what exactly is he here to do? Teach us how to mop more efficiently. A few quiet chuckles followed. Miguel's stomach twisted, but Victoria's response was cold, sharp, and immediate. No, she said, leaning back in her chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. He's here to explain what all of you have been missing. The laughter stopped. Miguel swallowed hard. It was time to prove that he wasn't just another invisible worker. A heavy silence filled the boardroom, thick with disbelief, doubt, and something else Miguel couldn't quite name. He could feel their stares, calculating, dismissive, waiting for him to fail before he even opened his mouth. Richard Bennett smirked, leaning back in his chair. All right, he said, his voice dripping with amusement. I'll bite. Tell us, Miguel, what exactly have we been missing? Miguel's grip tightened around the cleaning rag still clutched in his fingers. He had spent years working quietly in the background, watching executives in expensive suits make decisions from a distance. And for years, he had seen something they clearly hadn't. He took a slow breath. This was it. Sink or swim. You're looking at the wrong problem, Miguel said, his voice steadier than he expected. Your manufacturing output has dropped 14% in the last 2 years, but your operating costs keep climbing. And you're blaming labor, when really, he let the words hang for a beat, it's your machines. A flicker of surprise crossed a few faces. Miguel pressed on. Your cooling systems are outdated, and you've been overworking the robotic arms on the assembly lines. You're burning through them twice as fast as their intended lifespan, and that's costing you millions. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Victoria Kingston smiled, the kind of smile that said she had already known this moment would come. Miguel straightened his shoulders, meeting their skeptical gazes head-on. For years, I've watched you all throw money at solutions that don't fix the real issue. He exhaled. Well, now you know. So what are you going to do about it? The boardroom went silent. Not the polite kind of silence that came with listening to a presentation, but the stunned, uneasy kind, the kind that followed a moment no one saw coming. Miguel could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their disbelief pressing down like an invisible force. He had spoken plainly, directly, without hesitation, something these executives weren't used to hearing from someone like him. And now, they were scrambling to process the fact that a janitor had just pointed out a flaw they had all overlooked. Richard Bennett leaned forward, arms crossed, his amusement replaced with a challenge. And you're saying you figured this out just by, what? Reading reports in your spare time? Miguel didn't flinch. I've spent 9 years watching this company from the ground up. I see the factory floors every day, not just on spreadsheets. I hear the mechanics complaining when machines break down. I see the numbers in the quarterly reports, the rising costs, the missed targets. He let the word settle. I pay attention. A slow murmur spread through the room. Across the table, Monica Wells, the company's senior operations analyst, had been scrolling through live performance metrics on her tablet. Suddenly, she stopped. Wait a minute, she muttered under her breath, her brow furrowing. He's right. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Stephen Caldwell's face. What? Monica looked up. The data backs him up. We've been hemorrhaging money because of misaligned production cycles. If we fix the automation, we could cut costs by at least $10 million annually. A hush fell over the table. Victoria Kingston leaned back in her chair, the smallest smirk playing at her lips. Exactly what she had been waiting for. The tension in the boardroom shifted. Miguel could feel it, the weight of skepticism cracking, giving way to something new. The executives who had been so quick to dismiss him were now looking at each other, uncertain, recalculating. Richard Bennett's smirk had disappeared. Stephen Caldwell's jaw tightened. They weren't used to being proven wrong, least of all by someone who, up until 10 minutes ago, they hadn't even considered worth acknowledging. Monica Wells was still scrolling through her data, eyes narrowing as she double-checked the numbers. Finally, she looked up. He's not just right, she said slowly. If we make the changes he's talking about, we could recover at least $10 million in wasted costs within the next fiscal year. Miguel watched as a ripple of realization passed across the room. For years, these people had sat in this very space, discussing the same problems over fancy dinners and overpriced consultants. Yet here he was, a janitor, giving them answers they should have seen all along. Victoria Kingston let the silence hang for a moment longer, then leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. Well, she said, her voice smooth, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I suppose that raises an important question. Her eyes locked onto Stephen Caldwell. If Miguel, who has never been in this room before, could spot the problem in minutes, then why didn't any of you? The silence that followed was absolute. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was crushing. Miguel could see it in their faces, the way the executives shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that the power in the room had shifted. For the first time, they weren't in control of the conversation. Stephen Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard Bennett's usual smirk was nowhere to be seen. Even the younger executives, the ones who had chuckled at Miguel's presence just minutes ago, now sat rigid, their confidence shaken. Victoria let the silence stretch, giving them time to sit with the reality they had just been confronted with. Then, finally, Stephen exhaled sharply, straightening his tie. "With all due respect, Mrs. Kingston," he said, carefully measured, "this company makes decisions based on expertise, on years of experience in the industry. We don't just," he hesitated, glancing at Miguel, "throw around responsibility based on instinct." Victoria's expression didn't waver. If anything, her smile sharpened. "Interesting," she mused. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only person in this room who actually understands what's happening on our factory floors, isn't one of you." A murmur swept through the table. Miguel held his breath. This was the moment, the one where they dismissed him, sent him back to the maintenance level like nothing had ever happened. But instead, Victoria Kingston turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Tell me, Miguel," she said, voice smooth as steel. "What would you do if you had the power to fix it?" Miguel's pulse pounded. Because for the first time in his life, he had a real chance to answer. Miguel's heart pounded. He had spent years watching executives make decisions from a distance, knowing he could do better if only someone would listen. Now, they were. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for his answer. Waiting to see if he belonged. He swallowed hard. Then, steadying his voice, he spoke. "First, I'd recalibrate the assembly line sensors. Your production delays aren't from worker inefficiency, they're from faulty automation. Fix that, and you'll see an immediate increase in output." A few executives exchanged glances. Miguel continued. "Second, you need to overhaul the cooling systems. The old models are burning out too fast, which is why you're losing machines before their expected lifespan. Upgrade them, and you save millions in replacement costs." Silence. Then, Monica Wells nodded slowly, tapping her screen. "He's right." Miguel exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. He had done it. Victoria Kingston leaned back, watching the room absorb the truth. Then she said something no one expected. "Then I suppose there's only one thing left to do." She turned to Miguel, eyes sharp. "Give you the power to fix it." The room froze. Miguel's breath hitched. He had expected skepticism, dismissal, maybe even laughter. But not this. Across the table, Stephen Caldwell's brow furrowed. "Excuse me." Victoria Kingston didn't flinch. She leaned forward, fingers steepled, her gaze locked on Miguel. "You heard me." Richard Bennett scoffed, shaking his head. "You can't be serious. You're giving a janitor decision-making power over our manufacturing process?" Victoria's expression remained calm, unshaken. "I don't recall asking for your permission." Miguel felt his hands tighten into fists beneath the table. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "You want him to advise on logistics?" Stephen pressed, trying to rein in his frustration. "Or are you suggesting something more permanent?" Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that made even the most powerful men in the room sit up and pay attention. "I'm offering Miguel a lead engineering consultant position. Effective immediately." The room erupted. Miguel barely heard the objections, the disbelief, the quiet murmurs of a few executives who were already reconsidering their own preconceived notions. But above all the noise, one voice rang clear. His own. "I don't even have a degree," Miguel stammered. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. "And half the people running billion-dollar hedge funds don't either." Then she met his eyes. "What you do have is something far more valuable. Now the only question is, do you want the job?" Miguel's world tilted. 1 minute, he was a janitor, invisible to the very people now staring at him in shock. The next, he was being offered a position he had never even dreamed possible. His hands felt clammy. His pulse thundered in his ears. Every logical part of him wanted to say no, to step back, to walk away before they changed their minds. Before he failed. But then, he looked at Victoria. She wasn't offering this job out of charity. She wasn't handing him anything. She had seen his potential long before today. Miguel thought about the nights spent reading factory reports in the janitor's closet, breaking down numbers, analyzing problems he wasn't paid to solve. He had already been doing the job, he just hadn't been given the title. He took a slow breath, squaring his shoulders. Yes. A ripple of murmurs spread across the table. Victoria smiled. Good. But as the room settled, she added something no one expected. Because your first challenge starts tomorrow. Miguel's stomach clenched. He had won a seat at the table, but now, he had to prove he deserved to keep it. The meeting ended, but Miguel barely processed the blur of executives filing out, their hushed whispers trailing behind them. Some were still skeptical, some were impressed, and a few, like Richard Bennett, looked outright furious. Miguel, however, wasn't thinking about them. His mind was still reeling. Had that really just happened? Victoria Kingston remained seated, watching him with the kind of knowing expression that told him she had seen this outcome long before he had. Walk with me, she said, rising gracefully. Miguel hesitated before following her out of the boardroom. As they stepped into the private executive elevator, the reality of his new position finally started to settle in. The doors slid shut, and for a few moments, the only sound was the hum of the elevator climbing toward the top floor. Then Victoria spoke. You think this was luck? She asked, pressing the button for her private office. Miguel blinked. Wasn't it? Victoria let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. No, Miguel. It wasn't. He frowned. I don't understand. Victoria turned to face him, her sharp gaze locking onto his. I did my research, she said. Long before I ever walked into that break room, I already knew everything about you. Miguel's stomach tightened. What? The elevator climbed higher. This wasn't a coincidence. And as Miguel realized the truth, a new kind of fear settled in. Miguel's breath hitched. Everything about this moment suddenly felt different. Victoria Kingston hadn't just stumbled into that break room. She hadn't just overheard him by chance. She had known. I know your father owned a small machine repair shop, she continued, her voice calm but deliberate. I know you got into Cal State Long Beach for mechanical engineering, but life didn't give you the luxury of finishing. And I know that for the last 9 years, you've been working a job far beneath your abilities. Miguel's fingers curled into a fist. How long had she been watching him? I also know, Victoria went on, that you've been reading factory reports during your lunch breaks, keeping up with industry trends, and studying automation advancements when no one was looking. Miguel felt his stomach twist. She knew all of it. He swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this? Victoria's gaze didn't waver. Because I need you to understand something, she said. She took a step closer. This wasn't an accident. I didn't give you an opportunity. You earned it. The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal her private office. Miguel exhaled slowly. His life hadn't just changed. It had been leading to this moment all along. Opportunities don't always come with an invitation, they come with preparation. Miguel spent years believing he was stuck, that life had pushed him into a corner where his skills didn't matter. But the truth? His knowledge, his hard work, and his quiet determination were never wasted. He had been preparing for this moment long before he ever stepped into that boardroom. Too often, people wait for permission to chase their potential. They assume success is only for those with the right degrees, the right background, the right connections. But talent isn't limited by job titles, and intelligence doesn't come with a price tag. Miguel didn't expect his life to change, but when the moment arrived, he was ready. So, if you feel overlooked, if you feel like your skills are going unnoticed, keep learning, keep sharpening, keep growing. Because one day, your moment will come. And when it does, you won't have to wait for someone to believe in you. You'll already know your worth. The next morning, Miguel walked into Kingston Industries, but not as a janitor. The weight of his new title, lead engineering consultant, settled over him like armor. He wasn't sure if the executives respected him yet, but that didn't matter. He was here. He had earned it. As he stepped onto the executive floor, the air felt different. Some people glanced his way, some whispered, and a few, like Richard Bennett, refused to even look at him. Good. Let them watch. Miguel adjusted the brand-new suit jacket Victoria had sent to his apartment that morning. It wasn't designer, it wasn't expensive, but it fit. And for the first time in his life, so did this moment. Inside the conference room, a team of engineers and executives were already seated, waiting for his first presentation. The same people who had doubted him just yesterday were now looking to him for answers. Miguel took his seat, unfolding his notes. No hesitation. No second guessing. He had spent years watching from the sidelines, waiting for his moment. Now, he was at the table. And he wasn't leaving. Want more inspiring stories like this? Hit subscribe to X Daily Stories and never miss a tale that reminds you, your moment could be just around the corner.